My guest today is the author of the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, and it's called The Light and Flame. And if that didn't give it away, the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth is what we're going to talk about today. And of course, I always ask my guests, how did you get into the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth?
Well, part of my background was Polish, and although I wasn't especially interested in Poland as a child, I did find Polish history and culture fascinating when I came to visit as a student. And since the 18th century was my favorite period, it was natural for me to focus on the last few decades of old Poland, which, as I discovered, was in fact a commonwealth or republic constituted both by the Kingdom of Poland and the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, known to historians as the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth. In fact, a great deal of the most interesting things actually happen in the east, in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. So this was an extraordinary community of citizens, which I think has got a great deal to teach us. And so 35 years ago, I decided I would learn the language and I would specialize in the history, and I've followed that path ever since.
And how did the birth of the Lithuanian Commonwealth occur? One can trace back the origins of the I'm going to try to draw the PLC sometimes just to shorten it a little bit.
Right. I'll do my best to keep it brief. The Kingdom of Poland emerged out of obscurity shortly before the end of the first Christian millennium, where a state and Christianization came more or less at the same time. At a time when much of Central, Eastern, and Northern Europe were being Christianized. We get similar processes in Denmark, in Norway, in Sweden, in Hungary. The Bohemians or Czechs had got in about 100 years earlier. So the Kingdom of Poland emerges at the end of the first millennium. It initially grows very fast, then it contracts. It's divided up. It's partly put back together, but it's certainly one of the players in 14th century Europe. And it's at that point it sort of unites with the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Now, the pagan Lithuanians had not been converted to Christianity at the same time as their neighbors, the Poles, and to the south, the Russians or Ruthenians. In other words, the ancestors of today's sort of Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians. They found themselves at the head of a huge empire in what had been Kievan Rus in the 13th and 14th centuries, and they found themselves under pressure from a crusading order, the Teutonic Knights in the west, and also from Muscovite Rus to the northeast. And the best option was to convert not to Orthodox Christianity, but to Catholic Christianity, particularly as the Polish throne was there for the taking. And all it required was that for the Lithuanian Grand Duke to convert to Catholicism and marry the 12-year-old heiress to the Kingdom of Poland. And that's what happened in the 1380s. It starts off as a sort of marital contract, but it very soon becomes a good deal more than a simple union of thrones and dynasties. It becomes a union between political communities, because the Kingdom of Poland in particular was already a community where the monarch had to rule by the consent of the community of the realm, the more important of his subjects.
What made it a commonwealth and not an empire, not an empire in the traditional sense?
Well, the word Commonwealth is an early English translation of the Latin res publica. The later translation of that word will be republic. And that goes back to the old Roman Republic. And the res publica, which literally means the public thing or the public good or the common good or the shared good of a community, refers to the aims, the values, but also to the people that make it up. Now, it was perfectly possible several hundred years ago to have a commonwealth or republic while also having a monarch. Elizabethan England, for example, was often referred to as a commonwealth. The French writer Baudin referred to his Six Livres de la République, the 6 books of the Commonwealth. So the idea of a community of citizens, looking back to the model of the ancient Roman Republic, was considered compatible with a monarch, even if you could have republics in the sort of Italian city-states that sort of didn't have them. But on the whole, a crowned republic was a possibility several hundred years ago. And that's what the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth was.
And would you argue that one of the more famous kings, or rather queens, I suppose, it would be Jadwiga?
Yes.
So what made her so popular as a queen?
Well, so far, she is the only Polish monarch to have been canonized. Now, most countries in Europe have their royal saints. Some of them have several. And Jadwiga, or Hedwig of Anjou, was from her family background. She was of the Angevin dynasty, had come to rule in the Kingdom of Hungary in the 14th century. She was the daughter of the King of Hungary. One of his daughters would inherit in Hungary, the other one in Poland. She made a rather reluctant marriage for the good of her kingdom to the Grand Duke of Lithuania. But she then sort of devoted her life to the poor. She was saintly. She provided for education. She built up a fortune and left it to refound the Jgalonian University in Krakow, which her great uncle Casimir the Great of Poland had founded. So she died very young, but she provided the kingdom of Poland with its saint, and she made the marriage that linked the kingdom of Poland with the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which took it into a sort of a different league on the European status.
So how did you go on about governing the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, because it's quite a huge area and quite, but when I tried to look at the map yesterday from it, and it's a lot of it were Lithuanians, but as to the way I understood it, they didn't speak Lithuanian at the time. They spoke. Why was that? Why did especially the nobilities not speak Lithuanian, if that is correct?
Well, at the time when the union, the initial union made at Kreva in what is now the northwest of Belarus, was made between the Grand Duke of Lithuania and the Kingdom of Poland, or the Crown of the Kingdom of Poland, which effectively means the community of the realm. At that time, well, Polish wasn't a written language either. Now, the written languages of the time were Latin, German, and Old Church Slavonic for religious matters in the East, and what was known as Chancery Ruthenian, sometimes called Old Belarusian. It is influenced by Old Church Slavonic, and it was the sort of the legal language of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Lithuania was at that stage a spoken language, including the elites. When the Grand Duke of Lithuania wanted to speak to his cousin and didn't want to be overheard by the diplomats, they would use Lithuanian. But within 100 years or so, the Lithuanian elites were stopping to use the language of the country in the northwest, where modern Lithuania more or less lives now, and nothing particularly unusual in that. A lot of languages in medieval and early modern Europe didn't become sort of written languages of high culture. It wasn't yet certain that Polish was going to make that transition either, but that did happen in the 16th century. Polish did become a language of high prestige, high culture, literature, law, unlike in Hungary, where Magyar was only adopted for laws in the 19th century. In Poland, Polish was used for laws as early as the 16th century. Lithuanian was some way behind. It was printed, it was written down, but only for religious purposes with the advent of the Reformation. So Lithuanian didn't really become a literary language of high culture until the 19th century. And some of the elite had already gravitated to Ruski, that is, the old Ruthenian language, old Belarusian. Others in the 16th century, especially, increasingly moved towards Polish. It was a perfectly sort of, spontaneous process. There was no coercion sort of involved. Now, this is difficult for later Lithuanian national activists to sort of accept because their own elites had forgotten the language of their ancestors, but there was nothing intrinsically unusual in that process. It just happened.
And how do you go about governing this? Did the Lithuanians feel like was a part of the empire? And how did they govern this? Because as we talked about before, not necessarily because it conquered, they feel like they are a part of the empire. Was it kind of like Austria-Hungary, where they had their own government in Lithuania, or was it one government? Sorry, not Lithuania, but Hungary. So, as we talked about in the Habsburg Empire, Hungary was pretty much independent from Austria.
You can certainly make some analogies between the relationship in the Habsburg monarchy and that in the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, except that from the start it was a Lithuanian dynasty that had become kings of Poland. The analogy here would be the Scottish dynasty that became kings of England. Whereas in the case of the Habsburgs, it was the House of Austria that was elected as King of Hungary, and later they made themselves into hereditary kings of Hungary. In the case of the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, it was the hereditary Lithuanian dynasty that became elective kings of Poland. So it's like the other way around. The Grand Duchy of Lithuania always had a great deal of weight in this relationship, even after its territory was reduced at the time of the Union of Lublin in 1569, when what is now Ukraine became part of the Polish crown rather than the great Grand Duchy of Lithuania. The Lithuanians wanted a relationship of equals, the Poles wanted incorporation. There was a good deal of toing and froing, tug of war, before it finally got worked out, probably around the early 17th century, as a relationship that in some respects was of equals and in other respects was not. And it was a sort of compromise that worked for the rest of the Commonwealth's existence. So a union, not of equals, at least not in all respects, but one where the Lithuanians certainly were partners rather than simply parts of an empire. After all, some of the very richest nobles of the entire Commonwealth were from the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and some of its greatest heroes came from the Grand Duchy of Lithuania.
Now, before we go on to the next topic, there is something that I found quite fascinating when I was looking this up before this episode, and we mentioned the Lithuanians, but there seemed to be a multinational almost tolerance of religions as well as nationalities in. So what kind of other nationalities did we have in the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth? Because it seemed rather tolerant for the first time, if I'm not way off the books here.
In the first place, the word nation didn't necessarily mean the same as it would come to mean in the 19th and 20th centuries. We're not talking about mass nations encompassing an entire population. We're talking about those conscious, educated members of elites. We're not talking about tiny numbers here. We're talking as much as 8-10% even of a population, which compares quite well with a lot of 19th century franchises. But a nation, we're talking about political communities.
What other nationalities do we have within? That's what I'm trying to refer.
There was certainly a great variety of people speaking different languages with different faiths. In the east of the Commonwealth, the most numerous are the Ruthenians, in other words, the people who would later become Belarusians and especially Ukrainians. Then you have those who will become the modern Lithuanians and the modern Latvians, later on in the north. To the west, you mainly have Poles, but you have large numbers of settlers from Germany. Then you have significant communities of Armenian merchants, particularly of the southeast. And from the sort of, the earliest Jews had settled in the 13th century, but the numbers really increased from the 16th century onwards until by the 18th century, you have something like 750,000 Jews, which comes to well over 5, maybe as much as 7% of the population. It's the largest Jewish population in the world at that time, and would remain there in those lands until the Second World War. So a great variety of ethnic, linguistic, and sort of religious difference. It didn't mean that everyone was equal, but it did mean that they had to sort of rub along and had strategies for peaceful coexistence.
And I'm going to try to say this right, and probably won't, but how did the Schlachter democracy work, if I said it right, or how?
Right. The word Schlachter comes from the German Geschlechter. It refers to the idea of warriors and knighthood. And so in the course of the later Middle Ages, we get a social transition. And the Schlachter, or the noble estate, emerges. It's sometimes referred to as the Ordo Equestris in Latin, which is the equivalent of the equestrians in ancient Rome, that level just below the Senate.
Was it kind of democracy as we think of it, or was it not really a democracy?
Well, it was and it wasn't. Depends on your criteria for democracy. Out of the Schlachter emerges from a merger between the great lords and the knights, so this then becomes the sort of the estate of nobles as a whole, and it's very numerous. It's not quite 10% as was once thought, but it's between sort of 5 and 8% of the entire population. And it includes some very rich people, and it includes rather more extremely poor people. But it had a certain real sense of its own distinctiveness, of its own collective identity, and its values, above all, its attachment to liberty.
So, okay, and then, of course, so I've read quite a lot of Russian history recently and European history in general, and it seems that the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth always is mentioned there because it seemed to me that it is the European powers who elected into the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth. And as I was reading about Peter the Great by the late Robert K. Massey, he mentioned that it kind of was a little bit backward in Europe. Is that true to that? So,
well, by the time we get to Peter the Great, the Commonwealth is in deep crisis. It had been one of the most powerful, one of the most prosperous communities in Europe, not just one of the largest. But by the late 17th, early 18th century, it's had decades of wars being fought on its own soil. Its political system is suffering from a chronic lack of trust, and there is the possibility of foreign powers interfering through an excessively legalistic insistence on unanimity in decision-making. This is the notorious liberal veto. I think it's going a bit far to call the Commonwealth a backward child, though there are many places in Europe and beyond that could be seen as childlike from certain perspectives.
So, what was the Western? If it was such a crisis, and if it was kind of a backwater of Europe, what made the European powers so interested in having placing their own king or royalty there?
Well, royal elections were very much the norm in most of Europe in the late Middle Ages and the first part of the early modern period. over time, most of the monarchies in Europe tended to become stronger at the expense of their communities of the realm, the nobles, the burghers, the clergy, and so on. They ratcheted up the taxes, they increased the size of their standing armies, they would eliminate political opponents without going through due process of law. All these things were sort of happening. But the Commonwealth very much stuck to its principles of sort of republic and liberty, founded on the idea of a community of virtuous citizens. And that worked pretty well until the middle of the 17th century. And then it was struck by all these blows, and it proved unable to handle some of the tensions within its own society. Particularly badly handled the problem of the Ukrainian Cossacks. This, I think, was the point at which the Commonwealth entered a deep crisis, and it was not able fully to recover from that crisis, at least not until it was too late.
And of course, we have to talk about Catherine the Great and her placement on the crown. And I'm probably wrong. Was it Augustus she placed on the throne?
The person that Catherine the Great had succeeded to the empire that had been effectively created out of Muscovy by Peter the Great, and which had continued to grow under Peter the Great's less effective successors. And then, of course, she sort of got rid of her husband and took the throne for herself, and she needed a political success. She needed to show the Russian elites, and she needed to show other European monarchies that she was capable of making the decisions in the neighboring country, in other words, the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth. So she needed success. The person she chose was her former lover, a nobleman called Stanisław Poniatowski, who had helped her develop intellectually and personally a few years earlier when they were lovers. And she thought that he would be just the man, he would be dependent on her, he'll do whatever she said. And she was successful in getting him elected. And when he was elected, he took the additional name, apart from his own name of Stanisław or Stanislaus, he also took the name of Augustus, which was intended as a reference to ancient Rome, but also to his predecessors from the House of Saxony, Augustus II and Augustus III.
But he wasn't really interested in the throne, was he? He was basically just interested in Catherine because he did have feelings for her.
He would have preferred to have married Catherine and been the husband of the Empress of Russia to have been the King of Poland. That's clear. He thought that he was a Polish patriot. He thought that he could serve his country better as the Empress's husband than he could as King of Poland. But of course, that was never going to happen. He was not immune to the attractions of being chosen for the highest office in his own country. So having sort of, made his, so I'm not really sure about this sort of game. He did accept the proposal and he was chosen as King of Poland. Had he not been chosen as King of Poland, Catherine would have imposed someone else. Had she not tried to impose someone, there would probably have been a civil war between the main magnate factions in Poland, Lithuania. So, it's possible that someone else could have been chosen, but would it have been any better? Well, we don't know that.
Was he easy to control as Catherine anticipated, or was he a bit, as soon as he got on the throne, was he difficult to maintain? They
both misunderstood each other. She believed that he would be infinitely malleable, and when she underestimated his principles. He was a determined reformer. He wanted to see an enlightened Poland, and he was prepared to accept a setback in order to come back later and try again. And his whole 30-year reign is a story of sort of try and try again. If you can't do it this way, we'll try and do it that way. And he does get there towards the end of his reign with the Constitution of the 3rd of May, 91. But he makes a fundamental mistake. He thinks that Catherine, because she wishes to enlighten the Russian Empire, is also going to support the enlightenment of the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth. And she wasn't interested in that at all. She wanted to keep, Poland, Lithuania, she wanted it to be passive, submissive, and should it suit her, she could carve bits off of it and maybe share it with the neighbors if that should be necessary. There's no commitment at all to improving the state of Poland, Lithuania. As long as it sort of just stays inert, that's okay, although we may have to carve it up. Should it resist, well, that could only accelerate the process of carving it up. He didn't understand that until that process was already underway. He did come to understand it in the end. At that point, he just tried to choose the least bad options.
There is a letter, and I think this was in another historian's book that I don't remember which one, but where he does meet her, hope to meet her again, but it doesn't. I think it's just Potemkin that he meets, and there is a party and fireworks just a day or so, and then it has to go back to. I don't remember exactly when this occurred, but
you're referring to what Adam Zamoyski memorably called a tryst on the Dunyapa, and this happened on the 6th of May, 1787. Catherine was with Potemkin, who probably was her morganatic husband. He was certainly the viceroy of the southern parts of the Russian Empire.
He deserves an episode on its own for sure.
She was on her way to the Crimea, which had been recently annexed by Russia from the Khanate of the Crimea, and before that from the Ottoman Empire. And she was visiting the new provinces that Potemkin had acquired and was settling. And she did this on a great progress in a flotilla along the river Dunyapa. And the King of Poland was not allowed to leave his country without the agreement of Parliament or the same. Well, this was an opportunity to convince the Empress to allow an alliance between Russia and Poland to fight the Ottoman Empire. And this would, raise the profile of Poland, Lithuania, give the citizens something to do, something to cheer on. He thought this was, the right thing to do. So he travels all the way across Poland in the early spring, sort of waiting for the ice to melt and so on. And he sort of gets to the river Dunyapa, and he waits there for Catherine to come down the river in her galley, and he gets received by the Empress on board on that day, and they only have a few minutes together, tete-a-tete. But Potemkin is there. There's a lot of negotiation between Stanisław August and Potemkin. The proposal is made. There's some social events. The king, however, can't persuade Catherine to stay to come on board. They can't come to shore for a banquet, so she just watches the fireworks. This is this incident of light and flame when one of the hills on the banks of the river Dunyapa is dressed up as Vesuvius with sort of fireworks, and there's sort of it explodes in the Empress's honor. And that little hill, incidentally, was the Moskiewka, in other words, the little Moscow, which sounds rather ironic now. So this was the event. It set in train a great deal of excitement in Poland, Lithuania, unfortunately, the king was kept waiting for his answer. Events ran away from him. That was the real significance. It prevented something else happening, which might have taken things in an even more dramatic direction if the opposition had got in there first. But it was a kind of turning point in his reign.
What was the event that could have happened? Don't you try explain?
Well, he was being challenged by an opposition coalition of aristocrats, which was effectively saying to the Empress, you don't want to trust that man in Warsaw that you've made king. You should trust us, the first families, instead. We can rule the Commonwealth on your behalf more effectively than he can. That was the offer being made. Effectively, it was a group of oligarchs asking for a change of regime from the foreign patron. Not not a very attractive proposition. Of course, later the opposition would present itself as the patriots who'd freed their country from sort of Russian domination, but that it's best to draw a veil on what they were really up to in the 1770s and 1780s.
And of course, this brings us to, we mentioned the alliance, which brings us to the Polish army, and arguably one of the most famous of the, not just in Russia, I assume, but in Poland as well, the Cossacks and the Winged Hussard, which argues one of the most famous medieval knights, and or as I like to call them, the early Furies. How significant was the Cossacks and the Winged Hussars, which do you say?
Right. Well, let's take them separately. Not least because they were sometimes on opposite sides. But the Cossacks of Zaporizhia in what is now the south of Ukraine, at that point it would have been the far southeastern corner of the Polish crown. These were the freebooters of the steppes, people from different ethnic and social origins who wanted to join this rough democratic community at the end of the world, when they could sort of plunder the Tatars, but also and fight against them. But also these were people often in trouble with the law. Their leaders very much wanted to be sort of part of the Szlachta and to have the rights of free Polish noble citizens. And these free Polish noble citizens didn't really want to have them. But they were great fighters, especially infantry, fantastic in a siege. And the Cossacks provided a good deal of the Commonwealth's military strength in its successful wars against the Muscovites, against the Ottoman Empire, and against the Swedes. But the social tensions in that part of the world, and the religious tensions between Orthodoxy and Catholicism, led to a huge revolt in 1648, from which the Commonwealth never really recovered. Now, the Hussars, on the other hand, these were the initially medium-weight cavalry, highly maneuverable, ideally adapted to the open battlefields of Eastern Europe and the great spaces. They were maneuverable, they were adaptable, they were flexible, and when they charged with their lances, they could scatter more or less any opposition if they got the timing right. And they were effective on the battlefields until the late 17th century. Their sort of last really big victory was at the Second Battle of Parkain, which was just a few weeks after the Great Battle of Vienna in 1683. And their wings, well, in the 18th century...
Yeah, I want to ask what's the story there with the wings?
Yeah. Well, all the surviving examples show these great, enormous sort of harnesses.
It doesn't seem very practical, does it?
No, it doesn't. And they wouldn't have. And these were the ones that were used for parades in the 18th century. They were simply there to impress. For battle, they would have been smaller. They would have been fixed directly to the saddles and not to their backs. And they were... there's a good deal of debate about this. Was it because they rattled in the wind and created a noise? Was it because it made it harder to throw a lasso over them? Or was it simply a sign? Was it one wing or two? It takes time for the full set.
This is a target, shoot here.
To evolve. It certainly must have made quite an impression, even if the ones that were used for battle were rather smaller than the ones that we subsequently see in the museums of Poland, which are mostly from the 18th century, when the hussars had basically become a parade outfit, which were sort of brought out on special occasions, but they were not an effective fighting force anymore. But they were an effective fighting force in the 16th century and for most of the 17th.
Now, do forgive me for having to go a little bit back again, because we haven't really mentioned Jadwiga in this dynasty, but how significant was the Jgalonian dynasty in Poland? So do forgive me for having to go back a little bit in time again, but...
Well, they're hugely significant. And of course, they still have a great symbolic resonance, not just in Poland, but throughout the region. And we forget that that around 1500, three brothers Jagellon ruled over a third of Europe. We have one of them who was king of Hungary and Bohemia. We have one who was king of Poland. We have one who was Grand Duke of Lithuania. There was also a saint in the dynasty. Their brother Casimir, another one, became primate of Poland. So this was, quite a. The youngest one goes on. Well, the second youngest one goes on to outlive them all, is known as Sigismund the Old, and very much a kind of grandfather of Europe. So Jogaila, the Grand Duke of Lithuania, marries Jadwiga as a very old man. He has a couple of sons, one of whom dies as King of Hungary fighting the Turks at Varna in 1444. The other one reigns for a huge long reign as through most of the 15th century, marries into the Habsburgs. So we get certainly one of Europe's premier dynasties, but it's always a bit unstable regarding the succession. Are they going to be elected again in Poland? To what's going to be the relation between the Polish throne and the Lithuanian throne? Or then, this effort to acquire the thrones of Bohemia and Hungary, is it really worth it from the dynastic point of view? But ultimately, they have a sort of, through four generations in Poland and Lithuania, we have the creation of a mature community that's brought Poland and Lithuania together. And we have Renaissance culture, we have a prosperous economy. So although they've lost a bit of territory in the northeast of Muscovy, and they're no longer kings of Bohemia and Hungary in the south, the Jagellons are clearly one of Europe's great dynasties in the 16th century. And for that reason, their reigns are looked back as a kind of sort of golden age. But there was a fragility to that prosperity too.
And what would cause the fall of the Commonwealth? Because as we know, they were conquered, and then there wouldn't be independence until after the Great War, and then they would be conquered again and not really be truly independent until after the Second World War. So what caused the fall of the dynasty? Not the dynasty, but the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth.
Oh, the Commonwealth. Well, it falls into this crisis from the middle of the 17th century. And by the time we get to the reign of Peter the Great at the start of the 18th century, during the Great Northern War, which led to Russia becoming the premier power in the Baltic and the decline of Sweden. Then we have, but at that stage, it's going to be very difficult to mount a recovery. Russia and other foreign powers are able to manipulate the Commonwealth's institutions, but nevertheless, a recovery begins, an economic recovery, a cultural flourishing in ideas. And in Poniatowski's reign, we get this against the odds attempt to reform the Commonwealth, despite everything that Russia can throw against it, and also despite the suspicions of a large part of the nobility. There's a crisis in the 1760s. We get the first partition. That's a third of the country gone, with a third of its population. Another period of sort of quiet reform. And then after this sort of, of what happens on the Dunyapa in 1787, we get the impatient nobility taking over at a time when the Russians are fighting the Turks again in 1788. And this is the so-called 4 years Parliament or Great Sejm. And this leads to the thorough reform of the Commonwealth's institutions. The king sort of gradually gets himself back up the helm of things. We get the passing of the Constitution of the 3rd of May 1791, and a great future is in store for the Commonwealth. The prospects for the 19th century are excellent, and this is precisely what Catherine II cannot tolerate. Just as Putin cannot tolerate the possibility that Ukraine's going to be a success, that it's going to be prosperous, it's going to be free, and it's going to be an attraction for his own people, so Catherine II could not tolerate the possibility of a successful, free, attractive Commonwealth, which would attract peasants and burghers from the Russian Empire there, one that could block her expansion and projection of power westward into Europe. So the Commonwealth as a success was intolerable. It had to be crushed. She found herself a very small number of magnates who
of course it was a different time back then in the 17th century than today when Putin tried to invade Ukraine.
Yes, there were some big differences. The Ukraine is now being supported by by NATO, by American intelligence and weapons. Instead of having sort of Prussia and Austria on the other side, it's sort of got Poland, Lithuania, Romania. This makes a huge difference. And of course, Russia is, in relative terms, no longer the great power that it was at the time of Catherine the Great, even if it now has nuclear weapons, which again is another factor in the equation. Anyway, to return to the late 18th century, Catherine finds a small number of magnates. But I bet
Catherine would like to have nuclear weapons.
Well, I'm sure they would have transformed her power should they have been available. She finds a small number of people willing to do her will, but they're incapable of doing things properly. And then there's the opportunity to distract the Austrians who are fighting a war with revolutionary France. The Prussians have their price in the West, and Catherine can take an absolutely huge slice of strategically vital territory in what is now West Central Ukraine. And so we get the second partition, 1793. This provokes an insurrection among the Polish army led by the great Kosciuszko, who fought the British in America, and this has some successes. It shows again that there is great potential in Polish society for freedom, but it is crushed in the end, and then it's a simple matter of dividing up the remainder with Prussia and Austria. And so the Commonwealth is brought to an end in 1795, and 2 years later the three powers make an agreement to never again to use any name which could recall the existence of Poland. Of course,
doesn't that divide Poland and Lithuania between themselves, the great powers?
Sorry?
Doesn't they divide Poland and Lithuania between themselves in three
parts? Yes, they do. These were the three partitions. The final one, 1795, saw Russia end up with almost 2/3 of the overall lands of the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, and Prussia and Austria getting the rest.
So how does Polish people view the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth today and the history? Are they fascinated by it, or is it kind of like just history buffs who really try to study the Commonwealth, or is it widely remembered fondly?
There is fascination with the past. There's a lot of appetite for history in Poland, and a lot of arguments about history in Poland. It's still often referred to as the first Polish Republic sometimes. It's taking time to appreciate that this was not simply a predecessor of later Polish states of the 20th century. It was that, in a sense, but it was also a commonwealth that was formed out of voluntary unions with other nations and communities, hence the idea of the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth. That's not a name that was ever used in documents, whereas we can actually find the Polish Commonwealth in some 18th century documents. But the idea of the Commonwealth as something, a good deal larger, more diverse than the Poland of the 20th century, that's certainly sort of catching on. And of course, the hussars have never ceased to sort of fire the imagination. When Poland and Lithuania were restored in 1918, there was very much a sense of restoration. This was putting something back that had been taken away. It was not something that had simply been invented by sort of nationalist activists in the 19th century.
Did they consider having royalty again when they restored Poland, or was that kind of, we want a republic now?
Oh, well, it was Precisely because there was no ruling dynasty. There were some who wanted to go back to the Saxons at the start of during the First World War. Had the Germans won the war and created a puppet Poland, then they would have found some German royal, one of the Catholic branch of the Hohenzollerns, who would have made a suitable puppet king. But I think it was pretty obvious in 1918 that neither Poland nor Lithuania was left to its own choices, was going to be anything other than a republic in the modern sense. In the case of Lithuania, we have another German prince who was going to become Mindaugas II, but they couldn't reach agreement there. He would obviously have been a German puppet in the end. It was clear there was going to be a republic there as well. Just occasionally, the Kents get mentioned as possible kings of Poland by the small group of Polish royalists, but I don't think that's ever going to happen.
Yeah, I was asking because in Norway, when we became independent, there was a referendum if we wanted royalty or not, and we chose to have royalty for some reason. And beneath me, I don't see. Honestly, I don't see royal monarchy being a thing in the modern world, but we chose regardless to have monarchy, and we got the crown prince, I believe, of Denmark to come.
Well, Norway got its monarchy before the First World War. And there was also a very close British connection there among the Scandinavian royal families. So a little bit of a different situation.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on. Before you go, do you have any place where people can buy your books if they're interested in learning more about the Commonwealth?
Yes, well, thank you for the invitation to talk. If people would like to read more, then my book, The Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth, 1733 to 1795, Light and Flame, is published by Yale University Press, and it can be bought at the Yale University Press website, the UK website for deliveries in Europe, the American website elsewhere.
Thank you so much for coming on. It was a pleasure to talk with you. We are about that age as well. We are available on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, wherever you can find podcasts. And if you do have the time, please consider leaving us a little review and write a little review. It will help us tremendously. Please like, share, and subscribe. And I'll see you next week. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.